Hello everyone, this is Damon with PixNub Software. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the new green on green recovery system that we have inside of Easy Green Screen 6. You can launch this either from the menu item after extraction or from inside of Easy Green Screen. To start, if you are running this after extraction, you're going to need to make sure you have the full Easy Green Screen layer stack, so don't have it merge into a single layer. Also, don't rename any of the layers or merge any of the layers before running it because it needs all of the layers. I'm just going to show you here that Easy Green Screen creates a non-destructive layer stack, so it still has all of the pixel information available, and it's going to use this in order to recover. And one thing I recommend when you're doing green on green recovery is to have some idea of the colors that you're working with. So if you go into the foreground, color select, and make sure you're on point sample when you do this so you can see pixel to pixel variation instead of an averaging. But just see what the hue of your screen is first of all. And I can see on this 123 is about as low as I'm seeing up to 130. So that seems to be about the range of hues in the screen. Now in the shirt, the hues are in the mid 150s. And I'm pretty sure when I sampled earlier, I saw some hues, like right here, 137. So some of them were in the 130s and 140s. So the closer the hues are together, the more difficult it will be to separate these colors based on hue. But there are other separation methods available too. So I'll explain those in a minute. But just have an idea of the hues of your different greens so you have an idea of what you're working with. So I'm going to re-enable everything, and then I'm just going to run the green on green recovery. And it's first going to ask you to make a rectangle selection of the portion of your screen. Now don't make two selections like this, just make one selection that is a fairly good representation of the screen color, and then just hit continue. Next thing it's going to do is ask you to lasso around the area you're trying to recover. Now this is just a loose selection, you don't have to be perfect. However, try to keep all of the edges where it's green on green and minimize where you have skin on green or clothing on green, because the green recovery can recover green fringing in the areas, which is very simple to fix when it's done, but I'll leave this piece in here just so I can show you when it's over how to correct for that. So when it runs, we've got the default settings here. If you ever change settings and want to get back to the default settings, you can just click the default settings and that'll bring you back. And you've got 7 different adjustments. Also, if you have this use previous settings at start clicked, whatever settings you use last, it will load those instead of the defaults. So that way if you're working on a batch of images and you dial the settings in for your photo shoot, it'll load those settings up each time, which will save you a lot of time. So within these settings, we've got 7 adjustments. The top 3 adjustments are the threshold for how it's trying to separate the colors of green. And the bottom 4 are more for cleanup, smoothing, and feathering, and that sort of thing. So for the threshold, you've got hue threshold, dark green threshold, and bright green threshold. So first thing is I'll discuss the hue threshold. What this is, it's got a default value of 8. What this is saying is any hues that are more than 8 degrees from the screen color. So if you remember, our screen color was 123 to 130. When I took that sample, it took an average. So it was probably somewhere around 127, let's say. So this is saying that anything above 135 including the foreground or anything below 119. If you move the threshold down, you can see that it's bringing some of that screen back, because right now I'm saying, let me turn off, I'm going to turn everything off here because these will affect it as well. So I'll turn the smoothing and feathering all the way off. Okay, so now this is giving us an actual representation of, let me turn this down too. Okay, so now we've got a hue threshold of 1. What that means is that anything that's more than 1 degree away from the average hue color, it's going to retain. And so you see that initial selection we made, that's the only area that is being affected. So none of the other image is being affected. So that way you're really isolating this effect to your image. And so if this hue threshold value is too low, you can start bringing some of the screen back. If it's too high, now you see that the green color in the shirt, the hue was too close to the green color of the screen because it's less than 30 degrees away. Now it's not being recovered. And usually a value of 8 on the defaults works fairly well. And you can see here some of these edges are still transparent, and that has to do with these recovery settings. I'll discuss those in a minute. So let me turn the hue threshold all the way up so it's not having any effect. The next thing you have is dark green threshold and bright green threshold. The two adjustments you typically use the most are the hue threshold and the dark green threshold. Sometimes the bright green, but let's turn this dark green up so we can see here. What this is doing is it's not actually brightness it's going by, I guess, color intensity, for lack of any other terminology to give it. It's going by saturation and brightness combined. And so areas that have low saturation and or low brightness, it's attempting to recover those green areas. So dark areas of green you can recover. And if you go too high, you see you start bringing back some of the screen. Oh, and you see in here too, where it's recovering some of these, even though it's not dark, that's because the saturation is lower. Because like I say, this is more a color intensity versus a straight brightness. Now the bright green threshold, that's going to try to recover areas that have a higher green intensity than the screen. And this shirt is considerably brighter than the screen, so this bright green threshold is recovering the shirt. If you go too far, then the screen passes that threshold. All right, let's go back to the defaults again, which happen to work pretty well for this particular image. But I'll show you some things. I'm going to zoom in a bit here. All right, you see the default settings missed this area, and that's in the shadows. So I think that's because the hue was probably too close to the screen that it did that. And so you see if we move the hue threshold down, it recovers it. However, moving the hue threshold down gives us some more of this green fringing. So let me move that hue threshold back up. And you see we get less of this fringing, but that goes away. You could also use the dark greens, the dark, to recover that, because it's recovering areas, again, of low saturation and or low brightness. So this can often recover things as well as the hue. They both kind of work hand in hand. But if, like on the hue, if you go to start going lower, you see we bring back more fringing even around the shirt area. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now this can be corrected for as well. I'm actually going to, well, let me do these first. I'm going to turn this inner edge recovery off. Let's turn all these off again, because these are important adjustments as well. Although the defaults for these bottom four, you typically don't always need to worry about them too much. However, they can really fine tune and optimize and make your extractions look a lot better. So this inner edge recovery, what's happening is in these transition areas, for example, the shirt hues were mid 150s, skin hues are typically around 30, and you get a gradient of color between those, and that's what I'm calling the inner edge here. These gradient of colors on these edges. And so there's a point where these hues probably equal about 130 or so they match the screen very well, and those colors are almost identical to the screen, so those don't automatically get recovered. So this inner edge recovery that's got a default value of 2, what this does is recovers those inner edges. It has no effect on the outer edges, but only on the inner edges. When I say no effect, it doesn't expand or contract the outer edge, but what can happen is if you use a high value, you can add some slight bit of smoothing to the outer edges. So just use what you need, and usually a value of 2 you don't need to mess with. This edge contract, what this does is contracts the outer edge. So if you see the value of 0, we're recovering some of the greens on that screen, because what happens again is the hues of the screen mix with the hues of the shirt, and you get a gradient of colors. And so the more narrow you make that hue threshold, the more of this band that gets recovered. So we'll go back to the default value here of hue of 8, and the default value on the edge contract. I believe the default's 2 on this. And you see that that does a really good job of removing that. And the final 2 adjustments are smoothing, and this is just basic Photoshop edge smoothing. I'm going to turn it all the way up to 10, which is probably higher than you'll ever use. But you can see it smooths out any of the jagged edges. So you see with this off, your edges are a little bit jaggedy. I believe the default is 1 on this, so very low. It doesn't do a whole lot. And the edge feather, you see, let's zoom in a little bit further here. You notice this is a very, very hard edge because we are selecting a very narrow band of greens, so there's not any feathering. This is pretty much the pixels are on or off, which makes extractions look, cut out. It gives it that cut and paste look. But just a slight bit of edge feathering makes it look a lot more natural. And you may even want to move the smoothing up a little bit as your defaults as well. And like I say, if you have this button checked, it'll use your values next time. Now you can see how nice and clean that edge is. If we even contract by 1 more pixel, it may even look a little cleaner. It just depends on your exact situation. So I'm going to go back to the defaults again and just discuss the order in which I would adjust these. The first thing I would adjust is the hue threshold. So if you see, let's say you see not all of your screen is being erased. In this case, the screen was actually in this area. I think these hues were all within 1 or 2 of each other in this selected area. So that's why the screen gets erased. But if your hues vary more, you might see a little bit of that screen not being erased. Just turn this up. Now, if the hues are too close to your shirt and you can't get it recovered just with the hue threshold, the next thing I would look to see if your areas are darker or brighter. If they're darker, you can try turning the dark areas up and recover with this slider. If you have areas that are brighter, you can try turning this slider down. And then beyond that, once you have these 3 adjustments, then look at the edges. And really, let's go back to the defaults here. The inner edge recovery doesn't need adjusted very often, but if you see little specks that are removed inside on some of these edges, go ahead and turn this up a little bit. The main thing I look at here is if you have any kind of fringing on the edge, then in that case, maybe turn this edge contract up by 1 or 2, but just only as needed. And then if you want a softer edge and a smoother edge, use the edge smoothing. And then on this, like I said, we had that one little piece that just needed done in that shirt. So I'm going to apply this here. And then what we have when it's done is you have a layer group, and the green recovery is in its own layer group. So it's done nothing to the original layer stack. It's left it all above. And so any areas that you recovered obviously have no green spill correction. And also the areas around the edge of the skin can get green fringing if those are included in your selection. So that the group, this contains a layer mask, and this was the selection you made to affect the area it's being applied to. So if you were to skip that step, and it will allow you to skip it if you don't make that lasso selection and just hit continue, what you're going to end up with is the entire image now is being affected by the green on green recovery. And you see with those settings, some of those areas in the bottom right, the screen got recovered, as well as around the legs. So that's why it's always good just to try to make a decent selection. Now, if you have areas around the skin, like let's say it's not very much, but there's a slight, I'll try to zoom in so you can see it, there's a slight fringing that the recovery brought back because it was within our selection region. I mean, it's very simple. Just set your foreground color to black, grab a black brush. I suggest using a hardness of 100%. And you can go right over the edge here because you're only affecting the area that's being recovered. Just don't go over any of the green. And you can see I went too far, but I brushed off where we are making that selection. Let's say you did go too far and you need to recover that. No problem. It's in this layer mask here. So you can brush that back in. Now, if you have, let's say you have an area in your shirt. I'm going to manually force this here. Let's say you have an area of your shirt that's exactly the same color as your screen and it wasn't able to be recovered. So in that case, if you need to bring something back that wasn't recovered, you don't work in this group layer mask. You work inside of the layer mask that's on the layer within the group, because basically we're double masking. This is a double masking Photoshop technique, but it gives you a lot of flexibility by doing this. So if I alt click and show you this mask, this has pretty much given us a complete green screen extraction, but with pretty hard edges and nothing that's going to look good in the hair or around the skin, but it will look very good around the green on green areas. So all you need to do here is grab this layer mask and grab a white brush and just paint in any of the areas that need recovered, and you're manually forcing those back in the foreground. Now when you do this, make sure you are on the layer mask and not the layer itself, because if you go try to paint and you see this happening, well, that's because you're painting in the layer and not the mask. So if you just select the mask, then grab your brush and paint, you're painting in the mask while you're looking at the image. You can also alt click on Windows or option click on Mac and you can see inside the mask and you can paint in it as well. That's your decision about how you go about doing that. Anyway, one more thing too I'm going to do. Let's undo this again. I'm just going to show you here. Since we had that just one quick reminder, I think I mentioned it, but since we have this checked, I guess the only thing I did adjust on this that weren't default was the dark green threshold. But if you remember that small area that wasn't extracted, that was done with this dark green. And we are now using the settings that I used last time instead of the default settings. So you can see with the default, there's that small area. You may not even be able to see it in the video. But nonetheless, just a reminder, if you're working on a batch of images, use this checkbox because it's going to remember your settings so you can use those same exact settings again. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you're interested in easy green screen at all, please be sure to visit the website, that is pixnub.com. I've got a few more videos for this green on green recovery that will hopefully will show you some other situations and some other adjustment techniques. But really, this is very quick. Once you understand the settings, it should take you, 10 to 15 seconds an image tops.